Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the History of Maritime Wrestling, and today's episode is all about Real Action Wrestling. Real Action Wrestling was the biggest competition to Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling, and a lot of people say that Real Action Wrestling surpassed Grand Prix Wrestling in popularity. RAW's first show was on November 18th, 1999. The roster was made up of guys that had been wrestling for Grand Prix Wrestling. One of the stories floating around is once Emile Dupree found out that there was a new promotion, he said they made the cardinal sin promoting shows on my territory. With those words, one of the greatest factions in the history of maritime wrestling was born, the Cardinal Sinners. The Cardinal Sinners would become the biggest stars in Real Action Wrestling. The first show on November 18, 1999 would see Kurgan crowned the first ever RAW heavyweight champion. He won a battle royal to be crowned the first champion. And for this video, I will be calling him Kurgan, but he was going by the Giant or the Acadian Giant in Real Action Wrestling. The following year, Kurgan would lose the RAW heavyweight title to Cowboy Mike Hughes. Real Action Wrestling would also feature a hardcore title. Wrestlers like JQ Public, the Notorious TID, Massive Damage, Bloody Bill Scullion, and Evil Eddie Watts would all hold this title. 2001 would be a huge year for Real Action Wrestling, as they would find themselves on TV. They would also have one of the greatest roster in the history of maritime wrestling. The roster would include Chi-Chi Cruz, Evil Eddie Watts, Custom Made Man, Flesh Gordon, Wildman Gary Williams, Duke McIsaac, Joe E. Legend, and the Cardinal Sinners. The four members of the Cardinal Sinners were Brody Steele, who was wrestling as Kingman, Cowboy Mike Hughes, the Natural Bobby Roode, and the Acadian Giant Kurgan. One full episode of the TV show from 2001 is on YouTube, thanks to New Scott. If you haven't checked out New Scott's YouTube channel, he is a maritime wrestling historian. He has wrestling matches that, if they wouldn't have been preserved by him, they would no longer exist. This episode of Real Action Wrestling is from August 1st, 2001. On this card, Custom Made Man comes out during a Cardinal Sinners promo and challenges Kurgan to a match. The match would happen right then and there. Custom Made Man would get the win. This was a huge upset, beating the Acadian Giant Kurgan. Also on this show, Flesh Gordon beat Evil Eddie Watts, and in a hardcore match for the RAW Hardcore Championship, Massive Damage beat Duke McIsaac to retain the Real Action Wrestling Hardcore title. In a number one contenders match for the Real Action Wrestling Heavyweight title, the Natural Bobby Roode would pin Wildman Gary Williams after he hit him with a foreign object. But after the match, Commissioner Buddy Lane would reverse the decision, giving the win to Wildman Gary Williams. This would infuriate Kurgan, and one of the most popular angles from Real Action Wrestling would take place, as Kurgan would grab Buddy Lane by the neck and chokeslam him through a table. Buddy Lane would come back out later on in the show in a neck brace, and he would suspend Kurgan indefinitely. The main event on this card would see Kingman versus Joe E. Legend go to a double disqualification. The Real Action Wrestling Heavyweight Championship would change hands 10 times in 2001. Wrestlers who held the title in 2001 would include Cowboy Mike Hughes, Custom Made Man, Kurgan, Bobby Roode, Chi-Chi Cruz, and Wildman Gary Williams. The top feud in 2001 was the Cardinal Sinners versus the top babyfaces like Joe E. Legend and Wildman Gary Williams. In 2002, Real Action Wrestling would face some competition when No Class Bobby Bass would open up Atlantic Coast Wrestling. Kingman would be the big name poached from Real Action Wrestling to go to Atlantic Coast Wrestling. Eventually, Bobby Roode and Cowboy Mike Hughes would both be in Atlantic Coast Wrestling, but this would be much later on. Other big names in the territory in 2002 would include Evil Eddie Watts, Chi-Chi Cruz, Wildman Gary Williams, Johnny Wise Guy, Vance Nevada, and Scott Savage. Also in the territory at this point was Sarah Stock. Sarah Stock is probably most remembered for her time in TNA as Sarita. In Real Action Wrestling, she was the valet of Scott Savage. Sarah Stock would stick around the Maritimes for a few years, even working shows for mainstream wrestling. I have a little story here from Vance, Nevada. Vance told me that he was called and booked on 4 days' notice while he was in Winnipeg. He got the call from Evil Eddie Watts on a Sunday and was told you need to be in Halifax starting Wednesday and bring 2 separate gimmicks because you're replacing 2 guys. Vance would work the opening match under a mask with the name Insanity. He would beat Aaron Idol and would return later on in the night as Vance Nevada, beating Sweet Daddy Devastation. He would do that for another week, wrestling 2 matches a night. The TV show would continue in 2002, but once again, only 1 episode exists on YouTube, and it's thanks to New Scott. This show is from July 8th, 2002. This show starts with Wildman Gary Williams cutting a promo on the Real Action Wrestling champion Chi Cruz, but would get interrupted by Cowboy Mike Hughes and his manager and owner of Real Action Wrestling, Brian Marchand. Chi Cruz would then appear, and with the help of Cowboy Mike Hughes and Brian Marchand, they would triple team Wildman Gary Williams. Williams was set to get a championship match that night, but after the triple team attack, Wildman Gary Williams was injured and would not be able to compete. So the opening match would be a battle royal, and the winner would get the shot at the RAW heavyweight title at the end of the night. The last 2 men in the battle royal were Evil Eddie Watts and Bobby Roode. They would both get eliminated at the same time, so both men would challenge Chi Cruz in a triple threat match for the Real Action Wrestling heavyweight title. Also on this show, Scott Savage with Sarah Stock would beat Insanity. After this match, Insanity and Remington Steen would attack referee Cinder. This would lead to a match between Cinder and Remington Steen. Cinder would get the upset win. You might recognize Remington Steen under a different name, current Maritime Wrestling legend Lincoln Steen. Also on this show, Duke McIsaac would beat Johnny Wiseguy. Cowboy Mike Hughes would beat Wildman Gary Williams' brother, Madman Williams. And in the main event, Chi Cruz rolled up Bobby Roode in the 3-way match to retain his Real Action Wrestling Heavyweight Championship. Cowboy Mike Hughes would come out to beat up Eddie Watts with Chi Cruz, and in a shocker, Bobby Roode would join them in the beatdown. Chi Cruz, Cowboy Mike Hughes, and Bobby Roode would bloody Evil Eddie Watts. And that's how this show would end. In 2002, only 2 men held the RAW heavyweight title, this being Chi Cruz and Madman Williams. Chi Cruz would be the final Real Action Wrestling heavyweight champion. He would keep the belt and start defending the title in Premier Championship Wrestling out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. The 2 big rivalries in Real Action Wrestling in 2002 was Bobby Roode versus Eddie Watts and Chi Cruz versus Wildman Gary Williams. At the end of the season in 2002, Brian Marchand would close the doors on his version of Real Action Wrestling. I say his version because referee Cinder would actually bring back the name Real Action Wrestling for a handful of shows in the mid-2000s. Real Action Wrestling did not last very long, but it is remembered as one of the biggest promotions in the history of Maritime Wrestling. Guys like Brody Steele, Cowboy Mike Hughes, and Wildman Gary Williams became massive stars in the Maritimes thanks to Real Action Wrestling. Real Action Wrestling is still missed to this very day. And with that will be the end of this episode. Episode 7, we will be covering mainstream wrestling. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you next week.